Hi, everyone, and welcome to the last session of our Guilt-Free Book Club, spring of 2025, on Grading for Growth, a guide to alternative grading practices that promote authentic learning and student engagement in higher education by David Clark and Robert Talbert. Very excited to have with us a special guest, Katie Mattaini, professor at Tufts, who will be our featured guest speaker today. Before we jump into her remarks and our kind of question and answer and all that, I thought I would share with you our collaborative notes document and just talk about what we've been up to so far for those of you with us and also those of you watching this recording at home. So the link to that document is in the chat right now. Essentially, what we've done so far is we have divided the book into three. The book is in thirds, and in the first third, I'll share my screen so folks who are watching this at home can see it as well. Oops, wanted to go here. So you should have access to this as well. So our first meeting was actually with Professor Jeremy Wachter here who is with us today, physics professor at Wentworth, and we talked about the first section of the book. What is alternative grading? What is it all about? Why even be interested in it? Why do something different? And there's a lot of resources here, including a bunch of resources from our guest speaker today, Katie Mattaini. So thanks so much. And you should all be able to access those links, equitable evaluation, alternative grading in practice, podcast interviews, etc. Um, and kind of the key concepts of that are the feedback loops, this idea of feedback loops. And I'll come back to that as we talk about what this chapter is all about. And then our second meeting was about what alternative grading can look like. So that's the biggest section of the book, and that is about all these different kind of specific types of styles of alternative grading, including standards-based grading and specifications grading. We had a couple professors from Wentworth who used that specifications grading in their math classes, so they were able to provide a great discussion, which you can also watch and record the recording of on our website about that. And the chapter has all these case studies, so you can feel free to scroll through this document. I provided a bunch of summaries of the different case studies of different systems of alternative grading. And then for our session today, we have Katie, well, I'll introduce in a minute, additional resources, some more resources from Katie, and featuring some other ways to really plan your system. Because this part three is making alternative grading work for you. It's more of a workbook, kind of how to do it step by step that the authors walk us through. I put their kind of 10 steps in that they highlighted at the beginning of the chapter. And the one I wanted to highlight was the outlining of the core feedback loops. That's something that we don't tend to do when we kind of do a typical course design process. A lot of the other things are, starting backward design, starting with your learning outcomes first. That's kind of something you do in any course design. But the idea of really emphasizing that there's feedback loops that are built in. So it's not just they take the exam and get what they get and then move on. It's that, for an example, in that test style environment, maybe they, have the opportunity to make corrections. Maybe they have the opportunity to do a peer based a multi-stage exam where they get to work on it individually, they get to work on it with a peer, they get to revise, they get to do different things. So there's ways in which they get feedback and then get to act on that feedback, put that actionable feedback from the faculty member into practice to learn more deeply and kind of improve, and that their grade should reflect their growth, hence grading for growth and not just that one-time assessment. So and then also my favorite is sleep on it, then make it simpler. And in the author's experience, they tend to kind of overcomplicate things at the beginning. And so just kind of looking back and seeing how it could be more simple. So we'll start off by asking Katie about her alternative grading origin story. That's what we did in our other sessions as well. And feel free also for those of you in the session right now to add to our discussion questions, add to our key takeaways from this discussion, just so we have, again, collaborative notes, kind of our collective thinking made visible. If you were watching this on a recording and you want access to that, feel free to email us at teach@wit.edu, and I'll send you that document. So yeah, let me just introduce Katie. So really honored to welcome to the Wentworth Institute of Technology stage, virtual stage, Tufts biology professor Katie Mattaini, who is a thought leader in the higher education alternative grading community and is a lecturer in bio at Tufts. Dr. Mattaini is a contributing author to the Grading for Growth Substack, which we have links to all over the Collaborative Notes document. She writes about how alternative grading structures can support meaningful student-instructor relationships and how to explain the advantages of alternative grading strategies. She's been featured on the Grading podcast, discussing how alternative grading promotes inclusive instruction. The link to that is also in our Collaborative Notes. And she runs the Biology Grading for Growth online forum, as well as organizes the Center for Grading Reform's Grading Conference, which promotes grading practices that are focused on equity and authentic learning. Dr. Katie Mattaini, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here. Hopefully, we can have some good discussion. Yeah, I'm excited. All right,
Awesome.
I'll share my slides. I put the link to the slides in the chat, but if that needs to be reshared for folks who join later, hopefully somebody can reshare that.
I gotcha.
Mhm. Okay, so just kind of a guideline of where we're going here. I will share my origin story. We can talk a little bit about reasons for grading alternatively, although I know you kind of already talked about that in your first session, so we don't have to go into that in depth. Briefly touch on, some of the alternative grading systems that you probably covered in your last session, and then hopefully spend most of the time talking about kind of two case studies, ways that I've used alternative grading in my classes, and really, I want this to be as open for discussion as possible. If you have questions about how do you do this or how do you deal with that type of problem, I think that will be the most productive for people, hopefully. So feel free to jump in anytime, raise your hand, put questions in the chat. Okay, so this is a lovely piece of cross-stitch art. I am a major crafter and I really like to make a lot of snarky cross stitches and pedagogy related cross stitches. And this one relates to my alternative grading origin story. So at the time I started alternative grading, I was a lecturer at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island. And this was January 2020. I was at an in-person workshop, which was Deep Teaching Residency, DTR, for folks in higher ed, in STEM, who are interested in inclusive teaching. And so there were a bunch of folks there who were all really great humans who wanted to teach more inclusively. And we were all sitting around the lunch table and talking about different types of grading that were happening. And someone was talking about how one of their colleagues didn't give any partial credit on exams. And I, of course, was like, what kind of monster doesn't give partial credit? And then my now good friend, Drew Lewis, who was sitting next to me, who is a very like kind of quiet and self-contained person, was just like, well, I don't give partial credit. And so I was like, mm. And fortunately, Drew didn't judge me. We're still friends. And he explained to me about standards-based grading and how he would have a not yet met standard for his students and wasn't giving partial credit. And at the time, I had been teaching introductory biology at Roger Williams and had a lot of students who would be, really struggling, especially in the very first semester they come to college. They get to college, they take their first exam, and then they realize, oh man, these, study methods that I've been using throughout high school maybe aren't going to cut it in college. And I had been really looking for ways to help those students because it just seemed very unfair to me that a student could come to college, take one exam and do really poorly, and all of a sudden think, oh, I don't belong in a STEM major. And we have research actually that shows in that situation that minority students are more likely to leave a major in that situation than white students, even if you control for all the other factors like preparedness and things like that. So I had been looking for a solution to that was better than just doing exam corrections. And I was really intrigued by Drew's description of standards-based grading once I got past the idea that maybe that wasn't monstrous to not give partial credit. Okay, so I want to take a moment, at least just to get us in the right headspace. And I want us to think for a moment about what grades actually represent, maybe what we want grades to represent, what they actually represent in our classes. So I'd love it if you take the next 60 seconds on your own to kind of jot down as many things that you think a grade represents as you can, and then we can discuss. Does anybody want to share any of the things they wrote, either out loud or in the chat? Go ahead, Karen.
All right, I will go ahead and share mine. I'm not going to turn my camera on though.
No worries.
Um, the things that I had were competence, ability to do a skill, understanding of material, but also the ability to show that understanding, readiness for the next step, whatever that is. And then it's also a way to signal to others that someone knows something.
Mm, thank you. Go ahead, Jeremy.
Hello. I had, I think, some similar things to what Karen was just saying, like information about a student's mastery of the subject, maybe also information about how much time a student has spent with the subject, how much time they were able to devote to it. Then maybe in a different direction, not necessarily one I think is always ideal. For a lot of students, it's access to financial aid, especially if they're on like a merit-based scholarship.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else folks wants to share about what they think a grade represents or should represent?
One thing it can represent for students, I think, is kind of a goal to reach for, to get good grades is a goal. Now, it's kind of dangerous because then it could become an end in and of itself rather than the purpose being learning and that grade is representative of, the extent to which you learned. It could just be an end in itself, and that kind of cheapens the process and makes it maybe I think there's research to show that the if you have mostly extrinsic motivation, that the learning is less lasting, it's less meaningful, and it's maybe the type of thing you might forget after the cramming for the exam. You did it, and then you're done because that was what you wanted. Whereas if you're in a bio sequence and you're trying to be a biologist in a few years, that's not going to work very well when you get into the lab as a professional if you don't remember the basics that you learned. So
Definitely.
that's kind of a trap with grades.
Great. Is there anyone else who wants to share anything?
I think in part it can measure just like a degree of participation in class. Like, I mean, sometimes a zero, it could be you tried every problem, you got every problem wrong. Sometimes it's you didn't show up to the exam, and like um, it, it's it is a way to like measure like how much people are participating or even just attending, taking assessments.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it sounds like we've shared some things that are aspirational about grades, what we would like grades to measure, some things that sometimes can be negative about grades, especially the things we don't want them to measure, like people's financial situation is not something we want grades to measure. But a lot of times, if you look at data like that correlates grades with, for instance, Pell status, you can see a difference, again, depending on the class, the situation. Um, One thing so I'm definitely in the camp of I would love it if we could get rid of grades altogether. Um, but on the other hand, we collectively, as academia and schooling in general, have built a system where grades are students' currency. And so I do try to not um, kind of say anything negative about students for caring about their grades, because obviously they have to care about their grades in addition to their learning. And so that's kind of the angle at which I come at it from. And I want us to talk a little bit about not only some of the problems with grades, but how to kind of think about aligning how we assign grades with what we want grades to be, since we have to have grades, or at least I'm in a situation where I have to have grades. And I think that's also the case at Wentworth. So this comes from the article, if any of you are familiar with it, Grading Less or Grading Differently, just talking about some of the issue with grades, dampening intrinsic motivation, which Josh brought up. I think they can also, if you're asking students to do something that's quite difficult for them, can enhance kind of anxiety and make students really worried about doing something that is intellectually risky because they are worried about their grades. Um, and also competitiveness, depending on, again, the grading situation. I am hopeful that we are moving past a situation where we use some type of curving where people are actually based on, the highest and lowest grades, but I'm sure some places still do that. So that is obviously not ideal. Okay. This is a figure that I really love, that I actually took with permission, from a presentation that happened a couple years ago at the grading conference. Anna Santucci from University College Cork was the first author on this presentation. And it kind of points out how when people are thinking about what type of grading system, alternative or otherwise, to use, it's a value-based assessment that is kind of within a situational context. Because as we know, what is kind of possible or feasible within like a 400-person class is really different than what's possible in like a 20-person class. So I think our decisions about what we want to do in terms of alternative grading, they relate to our beliefs about learning, about how learning works. So for example, a lot of alternative grading is based on this idea that people learn by mistakes and that we don't want to penalize those mistakes. We want to build a system that acknowledges that people learn based on mistakes. We want to think about what procedures we use, what types of evaluations we like to use. I think that you don't have to redesign your whole class and every type of evaluation to do it alternative grading. And in fact, I think that's probably a bit too much to kind of bite off all at once. We just talked about the meaning of grades, and then, of course, what type of environment we want to cultivate. I think especially people who ascribe to more of the ungrading side of things talk a lot about trying to minimize the power dynamic that automatically exists between instructors and students, for example. Okay. All right. So I'm going to briefly go over some of the alternative grading systems because it sounds like most folks here are quite familiar with this. So when I talk about traditional versus alternative grading, traditional, I'm talking about using a weighted average with points, where the instructor determines a single weighting scheme. And then alternative grading could be anything else. And there are many types of alternative grading. Obviously, we won't go over all of these. And depending on people's understanding, I'll find that two people will actually look at one specific type, and one person will think it's specifications grading, and another one will think it's contract grading. So these categories, I think, are a bit fluid as well. Okay. So this list of 4 kind of similar features across different types of alternative grading systems comes from actually a Clark and Campbell and O'Shaughnessy earlier article before the book came out. So clearly specifying learning objectives, assessing for proficiency and not points, looking at eventual proficiency rather than in a particular moment. And then ideally looking and seeing that students can demonstrate that proficiency in multiple different ways. All right, so then kind of differences between systems. Again, kind of a disclaimer that most people I know, and I know a ton of people who do alternative grading via my interactions with people through the various networks that Josh mentioned earlier, a lot of times people will be like, well, I do a little bit of standards based and a little bit of specs and a little bit of contract. So everyone kind of has their own grading homebrew, as my friend Christina Reardon from Amherst College likes to say. You know what your context is, you know your students, and a lot of times the grading systems that people use tend to be a mix. Also, I think it's quite common for people to use different systems for different courses. I certainly have done that. So we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. Okay, so these are the three systems I'm going to focus on and three of the ones that I have used. So standards-based grading, in which you have a list of learning objectives and you are assessing students based on the different learning objectives. So it's kind of like pass-fail based on learning objectives, and there can be more gradations than that. And pass-fail usually ends up looking like I've met the objective already or haven't yet met the objective. Specifications will grade students on individual pieces of work. So if you have, for instance, a lab course where you have students writing, multiple lab reports, that's a situation where I use more of a specifications grading angle, where I'm saying, okay, for each component of this lab report, I'm giving you a certain score in the specification system. And then the third one that I've used is collaborative grading. Sometimes people will call this ungrading, where the actual grades or marks are minimized as much as possible. And then at the end of the semester, if you're in a school where you have to give a semester grade, that's determined collaboratively between the students and the instructor. All right, so when I am talking to someone who's interested in alternative grading and doesn't quite know kind of where to start or what system they're interested in, usually the first question I talk to them about is, do they want to use something that is a little bit more student driven, like collaborative grading, or do they want to do something different? And I think that this is, to me, the first decision that you want to make, because collaborative grading really cedes a lot of control to the students, or at least some level of control that's not usually there, right? In a traditionally graded system, the instructor does all the grading, and in a collaboratively graded system, there's more of that onus kind of on the students. And because of that, I think it requires students a little bit more to have developed metacognitive skills. And so that is a situation where I think collaborative grading can be a good fit. One thing that is, I think, a bit of a like myth that is out there is the idea that if you are in an ungraded class, everything is really loosey-goosey and there's no structure and there's no guidance. And I really think that that is false. I have done this, and it can be a highly structured class and still have collaborative grading. So hopefully we'll get some time to talk about how that can be done. Okay. And then if somebody doesn't want to go like full on collaborative grading, I think oftentimes we talk about this difference between standards-based and specifications-based. So again, I generally find that if you have kind of a list of content objectives, that tends to be more in line with like a standards-based grading. If you use a lot of tests and quizzes, I think that standards-based is a little bit more of a natural fit. Assessment can generally be reattempted, and the standards can span across assessments. Again, specifications, if you have a bunch of projects, essays, etc., those are a bit more specifications based. And usually instead of reattempting, it is a revision. Okay, so before I jump into case studies, is there anything people want to talk about with that, or questions that folks have?
Karen, why don't you
Yeah.
jump
Karen, go
on
ahead.
in?
Yeah, I have a quick question. So I've not really heard much about this collaborative grading
Yeah.
system before.
Mhm.
Can you, I know you're going to do case studies, but
For
can
sure.
you just give me a quick example of like what that would look like, or how
Mhm.
that actually works in practice?
Yeah, so basically the feedback there, they still get a lot of feedback. So the feedback is written rather than, so qualitative written feedback rather than like an ABC or a number grade. So instead of having a mark, whether it be a letter or a number that indicates kind of the quality of the work, it's more written feedback. Like, here are the things you've done well. Here are things you might still need to improve on. And then it kind of depends on the person. You'll see in a minute, I have kind of, when I've done this, I give it a bit of a contract flavor, because I find that if you give no guidance at all on what an A looks like, my students got really anxious about it. And so I was like, here are the kind of qualitative things I would expect you to do if you want to give yourself an A type of thing.
Yeah, something to
Great,
add about
thanks.
that system is that, there's a lot of ways that people go about it, but it really comes down to like a values-driven thing, as you
Yeah.
indicated in your earlier slide. Um, it definitely, in addition to teaching metacognitive skills, it teaches students the hidden curriculum, kind of opening the hood and being like, okay, well, let's be part of this together. But it's important to note that it's not like the students are giving themselves their own grades. The professor is still the one in charge of it, giving the grades. But it happens in a sort of dialogue, where a student might, argue for giving themselves a B, and you're like, actually, I think you got an A, and here's why. And the student might argue for giving themselves an A, and you think they got a B, and it's a learning opportunity. One other thing
Mhm.
before we go to Catherine is just this: there's research to indicate that if you give a student their test back and it has a big 73 on the top, but then you wrote a bunch of comments about what they could have done, they're not going to take in the comments very much. Um, they're going to see the grade. And so the one of the kind of where that term ungrading comes from is to make it more focused on the meaningful, actionable feedback, again, those feedback loops, and about the learning rather than about the grades. So to try and focus that by systematically kind of stripping away the kind of, you get points for every single thing, to make it more of an intrinsically motivated activity. Yeah, Catherine.
Um, so I'm wondering if I'm wondering if collaborative grading kind of connects with a different idea that I've heard about, that I've kind of been thinking about. And this is like portfolio based. And so a lot of my teaching is online. And so one thing that I've heard about is where students kind of select from like their discussions over the semester, like two or three out of all the ones that they've done that they want, to kind of be part of a portfolio.
Mhm.
And then I'd see like a connection between that metacognitive, like the student is kind of making those selections and choosing kind of the work that they want to be as part of like the finished, if you said, I don't know. So I don't know. It's like something like, could you see something like that fitting into
Yeah.
the collaborative scheme?
Definitely. So, what I usually do is I have students basically write a learning reflection 3 times in the semester. And I've heard a lot of people who have that final reflection where they actually do suggest their semester grade, or like start the discussion about the semester grade, use a portfolio and kind of have additional metacognitive piece to it, where the student is explaining like what they think about this piece of work is exemplary or how it fulfills some learning objective, and kind of use that as their evidence for what grade they think they have earned. So yeah, I've definitely seen that before. I don't particularly do that, just like based on the way my classes have worked, but I've definitely heard people use those two things in conjunction. Go ahead, Karen.
Yeah, so my classes are a lot of lab classes where I have TAs that teach particular sections and they help with the grading. So I'd be particularly interested in learning more about how you all help your TAs learn to grade this way, because there's no way I can take on grading everything. And so sort of like thinking about how do you bring your TAs, who are also for the most part students, to be able to help you do this in a reasonable way.
Absolutely. Yeah. So when I taught at Roger Williams, that was a primarily undergraduate institution. So I didn't have TAs. And now that I teach at Tufts, I often do. And so actually the past year has been the first time I've been doing this with TAs, and it's definitely a process. For a lot of these things, I find there's kind of an iteration process, like there is for most things in teaching. I would say in my lab class, we're using specifications grading. And I'll talk about this in a minute. There's basically a four-level system that we use to mark things. And I find that having, just like with points, like when your TAs are grading based on points, having some type of rubric or some type of benchmarks of what you're looking for can be quite helpful with that grading piece. But I am also still kind of working through that. So I'm not an expert by any means. Go ahead, Catherine.
I just wanted to share that my husband is using a mastery-based grading approach, which is probably similar to standards. I
Yeah,
don't know.
they're the same. It's just a different name. Yeah.
And he's got TAs, and so what he does for the homework assignment is he actually like provides a grading, like he'll do it himself. He'll provide that to the TAs of like, this is what I'm trying to see. And then he's like, so he kind of trains them on what he wants to see in the kinds of feedback that he wants. And then he's kind of coached them to say like, if it's not at the level of the work that he wants the student to see, because it can be revised or reattempted, I don't know, whatever you want to say, then to give like specific type of feedback. So it's not just like the solution to the problem, kind of like gives them some ideas of like how to move forward with the problem without giving them the full on solution. So, and I think he's found it to be pretty successful this semester. He's tried it out this semester.
That's awesome. Thank you.
So I want to ask a question about that maybe, again, this isn't the right time and place. So if it's not, tell me to shut up. I tried using a resubmission in a class I taught last quarter. And the problem that I discovered was that the students basically found who got each question correct and copied that answer. And so they didn't actually do the learning. They just did, like, which is fine, like totally clever of them, right? That's the right way to go for them. But like thinking about how to make it so that it's not so just like go to somebody and you get the answer and you don't understand why it's the right answer.
Yeah, to me, that sounds like a reattempt versus revision question. So in this case, maybe revision is not the solution. Maybe reattempt is the solution. That comes with a different level of work for us as instructors.
How do you
So,
define the difference between those?
so revision would be like basically exam corrections, for example, and reattempt would be like new questions on the same subject or the same skill.
Do you mind if I jump in again? So just to kind of share what my husband does. So he's got the feedback. So he teaches Calc 1, by the way. So Calc 1 second semester. So you can kind of get a sense for where we're at. Is that the homework is he does this homework where the TAs give the feedback. And then I want to say that it's like there's a quiz after every unit and then an exam after every 2 units, but the quizzes are in class. And so if you don't do the loop, then when you get to the quiz in class, like you can't do the quiz. So you just can't do it well because you're in class and you have like 50 minutes to do the quiz. So part of it is like the whole system. And so that's kind of provided some incentive to students to try to figure it out through the reattempts, because they know that they will need to, on the quiz in class, be able to solve similar problems.
And it sounds like what you like, if I want to generalize that, it's basically like, how can you create incentives, right, for students to do the authentic learning, I think. Okay, so those are kind of the general stuff. So I think that explaining these things can be a bit easier when you have like more concrete examples. So I have planned kind of two, or I'll have slides to talk about two different ways I've done this in two different classes. But however much we get through or don't get through, I think that's totally fine because discussion, I think, is very fruitful. These case studies are also in a document format. So I think the link to these slides were shared in the chat. The document just kind of has these as a table. It also has an additional case study that goes through one where I did it in a lab class. And the way that I've kind of laid this out is following those workbook sections from the book, thinking about how someone would design their class in an alternatively graded way. Okay, so this first one is my molecular bio lecture that I'm teaching right now at Tufts, mostly standards-based grading, also known as mastery grading, some specifications kind of mixed in. Again, we all have our own kind of homebrew depending on our goals. Okay, so the first thing that Talbert and Clark ask us to identify is our course context. Of course, that's extremely important. These are mostly junior and senior bio and biochem majors. It's elective for the bio majors, required for the biochem majors. This class is taught both semesters, fall and spring. I teach it in the spring. I have another colleague who has taught it for many years in the fall, who is like an award-winning professor. I have come to Tufts, started last year. And so that was a little bit intimidating. Thankfully, I did my postdoc at Tufts, and this other instructor was one of the people who taught me how to teach. So that's been really fun to kind of come back and get to work with him. One of the reasons that they hired me was so that they could teach this course both semesters because it was getting to be a size that they felt was too large for an upper level course. So right now my course has about 45 students and his in the fall had about 100. So we're thinking that over time, as people kind of get used to having it in both semesters, that those numbers will even out a little bit. So I currently don't have a graduate TA because you need 50 students to have a grad TA and I have 45. But I have done something very similar in the past when I taught intro bio at Roger Williams with about 70 students. So it is scalable for me, at least to that degree. Okay. All right. So if I'm thinking about the learning objectives for this class, there are several learning objectives that I think of as kind of cross-cutting that are irregardless of what we are talking about topic-wise that week in class. So we do 3 journal clubs over the course of the semester. So one of the objectives is reading papers in community with their peers. So that's going to play into how I assess that. Also, after doing each of those journal clubs, I want them to be able to think about the study as a whole and design one next experiment that they would want to do based on a question that's still unanswered. Being able to analyze data based on the types of methods that we talk about in our class, being able to select the appropriate method to answer a particular type of question, like the appropriate experimental method. I have a learning objective that is having students practice. You can get an A without meeting this learning objective, but I do find it is useful to try to incentivize different ways students can practice. And so this can include, I'll talk about this in a minute, but it can include things like being in class and participating in the in-class activities, doing the homework to a certain level of correctness, going to our recitation with our undergraduate LA, asking questions on Piazza, which is like our asynchronous question platform. So lots of different ways where they don't have to be in class every day, like if they're sick or anything like that to meet that objective. And then all the other learning objectives are kind of the content ones based on what we're learning in any particular week. Anything else to say about course structure? This is a semi-flipped class, so we try to do lots of activities in class, but there is some direct lecturing as well. And so these are the different ways that I like to assess these learning objectives. So I told you the paper reading one is in community with their peers. So we use Perusal, which is a social annotation platform. There's also Hypothesis, which is the same thing, just I think a different company. So the students can comment on the papers. The design a next experiment, they're just these little short proposals that they do. The practice one, I already talked about different ways they can get practice credits. And then the other ones, the technique selection, data analysis, and the various content objectives, those are all assessed on unit exams and retests. So again, I'm using mostly standards-based grading, standards for all the things that are being assessed on tests, and then some specs for like their little proposals of the next experiment, things like that. Okay. So the marking system that I use for this is an EMPX system, which is similar to EMRN, if you've heard of that before with Clark and Talbert. So E is exceptional, M is meets the criteria or meets expectations, P is progressing, and X is if they didn't hand something in or they handed it in the wrong file or something, like it's not accessible. And then, as you've probably seen, if you've looked at any of the Clark and Talbert book, I basically have a table that lays out for an A, what do you need in terms of the EMPX scores in the different categories? For a B, what do you need in the different categories? And we have ways of calculating, minuses and pluses and what happens in various different circumstances. I will say at Tufts, most of the students, like if I ask them, what's your goal grade and like be honest, they're like A, definitely A minus is bad. So although I have criteria for C and D, like that usually has not come into play unless I have someone with a really extenuating circumstance. Okay. So feedback loops, right? This is the thing that is really core and different about alternative grading. So there are a couple places where feedback loops come into play in this class. The two major ones are these next experiment proposals. So I already told you we have 3 journal clubs. They do one of these proposals after each one. The third one is kind of more substantial. So the students can revise the first 2. So they submit it, I give them feedback with an EMPX score. If they didn't get an E and they want to revise, they can. And then their new score replaces their old score. So if they got a P and they revise it to an E, it's as if they never had the P. They just have the E. The third proposal is submitted during finals, so they can't revise it. However, we do start it like 2 weeks ahead, and so there is plenty of opportunity for students to get feedback before they submit. And then the big kind of the feedback loop, I guess, that affects most of the learning objectives is the tested learning objectives. So we do have 3 unit exams. This isn't written on this slide, but it's very important. So I am still doing take-home exams, even in the age of ChatGPT, and other generative AIs. I'm still trying to think about to what extent that makes sense. I think there are questions I can still ask, especially the more data analysis questions that are still not ChatGPT-able, at least for now. So I do open book take-home exams. So that is going to come into play here. So again, feedback on exams for each tested learning objective, they get an EMPX score. If for a specific learning objective, students are not happy with their EMPX score, they can submit a learning reflection to get an opportunity to retest. Full disclosure, I don't usually really read their learning reflections, but I do like skim them to make sure they didn't just, type nothing. They can retest on new questions on the same material, up to 2 learning objectives per week. And that limit is mainly for myself so that I don't totally lose my mind and so that this remains sustainable. And I explain that to them that this is the reason for this limit. And so far, they've really understood that and appreciated that, this is a reasonable thing, that you are human. I'm trying to treat you like humans, and this is why this limit exists. And then I don't have a typical final exam. We have our 3rd exam the last week of classes. And then instead of having a typical final, they have an opportunity to retest more learning objectives during finals period. And again, because our regular exams are take-home open book, all of the retests are also take-home open book, which is one of the ways for me that this is more manageable. So one thing that's not in kind of the workbook that Talbert and Clark give is something I still think is really important, which is how you are going to explain your grading system to the students. Because one thing that I have found, especially when I was first using alternative grading, was that I was surprised at how confused students were, even if you have a system that's extremely simple, just because it's like so different from what they're used to. And sometimes students don't trust that you're really trying to do something that's good for them. And sometimes they just don't believe like it's a too good to be true thing in their minds. And so I've really tried to refine how I talk to students about the grading systems. And one thing that I've started to do is not describe it in as nitty-gritty detail at the very beginning. Like on syllabus day at the beginning of the semester, I will give them a document that explains the nitty-gritty details because some students get anxious if they don't know that. But I'll say to them like verbally, like, here are the things you need to know right now. Here are things like the homework. Here's how we deal with attendance. Um, Later on, when we have an exam, here's how it's going to be assessed, and you'll have a chance to retest. But like, let's not worry about that right now because you won't remember in a month or however long when you get the feedback anyway. And so far, that has been a pretty good approach for me. So after exam one, and they have this feedback, usually again, these are take-home exams. So I'm doing grading like and giving them the exam back like not in class, right? This is something that's happening virtually. So I will send and post a detailed explanation of the retesting like procedure with frequently asked questions on our LMS. And then when I see them next in class, I will start out by addressing any questions that they have. And at that time, I also assign a learning reflection. And this has a series of questions that walks them through how their current grade is being determined with all the different categories. And I also ask students like what their goal is and be like, okay, in this category, does your current standing match your goal? And if not, like, what are the things you're going to do to get to that goal? Because there's usually something that you can do to revise or retest, something like that. And so that generally helps people understand where the grade is coming from and also helps them make a plan to meet their goals. And then, of course, grade tracking. This is another important thing. You can use the Learning Mastery Gradebook in Canvas. At least our campus has Canvas. I don't know what all of your campuses have. I use a self-built gradebook that I made in Google Sheets because I am really like to like be very specific about what I want to communicate to students. And because I want that level of control, I've made my own. I have one central sheet where I input everything, and then basically the data gets pulled out to individual student sheets so that they can only see their own. I've joked that if I ever kind of quit teaching, this will be my my side business is making grade books for people who do alternative grading. And then some logistical stuff, like I just use technology to try to help me distribute the retests in a way that is easy. This was the thing that almost killed me the first semester I did this was like, how do I distribute learning objectives 5 to this person and 6 to this person and 7 to that person. So I learned how to use Google Sheets, Google Forms to make a spreadsheet and use the spreadsheet to make a mail merge and like just automate everything. And my life has been so much better. So leverage technology. That's the take home from this. And I think that's the end of that. So probably a good place. I know that we're not going to get to talk about the other one, which is fine. Because all of it is in the document that I provided you in the link in the slides. But what do people want to talk about from this or just in general about how to make alternative grading work better for your context? Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks for laying this all out. It's very helpful, I think, to see like the spreadsheets and how things connect together and talk about the specifics of what you're doing. I really want to do something like this for my intro classes, so seeing that it is achievable is very heartening.
Yay. Happy to
Uh,
chat more, also
yes,
offline if you want to.
yes, for sure. One thing maybe, so in the Wentworth context,
Mhm.
the especially in the intro classes, the grade
Mhm.
goal is often not an A.
Yeah, definitely. And that's how it was
Um,
when I was at Roger Williams.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's so maybe for that one, I would be curious about like those middle
Mhm.
ranges, like especially the D, sort of the passing for a lot of the
Yeah.
students is a goal. Um, I'd be curious as to like how to structure that part of the grading chart to really make
For
sure that
sure.
knowing that yeah, the students are going to be shooting for a C, that they're still
Mhm.
getting to that point that we want.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, that is much more what I had when I was at Roger Williams. I sometimes had students even repeating the class to try to pass. This is my last slide. It has different alt grading syllabi in it. And that one does, I believe, include my one from Intro Bio at Roger Williams. So that might be one example you could look at for a situation like that.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Catherine.
Um, I just think it's really interesting. I really appreciate you talking about the context to
Mm,
everything. And so I think one thing that I kind of took away from your presentation is just how important it is to be context specific. Um,
yeah.
and just the example is my husband teaches Calc 1. And
Mm,
so you might wonder like these in-class quizzes and, like, is that stress? But it's like the answers to everything Calc 1 are online. And
yeah.
so like it's kind of like, you kind of got to think about like what's your ideal and then like what's your context and what's going to actually help your students achieve what you want them to achieve, which in, you know, his case is that they can take these ideas and then use them in future classes because most of them are STEM and they don't
Yeah.
really want to learn math for its own sake. So I just think that's really, interesting so I really like that you shared, like, hey, I do, this kind of thing and I do this. And then we think about like what our context is because I think it's important that we recognize, that even though what you're doing works really well in your context, then it might need some adjustment. We can't just like
Yeah,
necessarily take
100%.
it. So I just really appreciate you being willing to share that with us.
Yeah. In fact, this is my little last thing is like, how do you choose? How do you figure out what system you want to do? Like your context, your goals, your beliefs, right? Hopefully somewhere they can meet in the middle. And Rissa Sorensen Unruh, who is someone who is quite interested in ungrading and I believe wrote her second thesis because she has a PhD, I think, or master's in chemistry, and then now is doing a PhD in education, wrote on ungrading. So she taught organic chemistry in a way that was ungraded, which I'm like, that blows my mind. And one thing she always says that I think is really helpful is you need to make decisions that you can live with, right? Both in terms of your values and in terms of the practical constraints. And like those practical constraints are real. And if you don't do things in a sustainable way, that doesn't help anybody, especially you. So, very briefly, I will just say that this is what I have done in kind of what I just described with the standards-based grading is what I've done in kind of more lecture-based classes. When I was at Roger Williams, I also taught this kind of advanced paper reading class in cancer biology. That was an elective. My big goal was really to get people to not be afraid of reading primary literature. And so that was the one where I chose to use collaborative grading because when you're trying to teach students to read literature, I think it's not it doesn't make a ton of sense to try to grade that with points. Like you're trying to support them in becoming more sophisticated readers, and it's quite a scary thing to do. And so for me, that was the right setting or the right set of goals to use collaborative grading in that case. And again, if you want to look through the materials more, I did have a bit of a contract there, but it was same population as when I taught intro bio with standards-based grading, but very different goals, therefore different system that I chose to use.
Can you tell us anything about the other communities that were on your last slide that you are
Yeah,
a
for
part of?
sure. Yeah, so I am, what is my title? I'm the co-chair of the organizing committee for the grading conference, which is an online conference Registration is $50 or pay what you can. That takes place in June. We just finished selecting the talks for this year. I am super excited. It is going to be awesome. Highly recommend. People have told me that it is the only online conference they actually enjoy. Um, really great time not only to like learn more but also to find community around this, because that is my other big take home is all of these things are much better in community. Teaching in general is better in community. So I also founded this Biograding for Growth community of practice, which is basically people who attended the grading conference who were like, man, it'd be great if we had this more than once a year. So it's very informal. We just meet on Zoom and kind of talk about any um, kind of hurdles we're trying to overcome, situations we encounter, try to support each other in our alternative grading endeavors, and in general, dealing with all of this that is teaching, and it's amazing. So happy to welcome anybody there as well.
Well, thank you so much for this incredible presentation and all the resources,
Yeah,
and for
sure.
your offer to keep the conversation going. Really appreciate your sharing your expertise with us, and certainly look forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everyone.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.